Biodiversity is the life support system of this planet, and we've got to get that message out there. We're all related. Everything is related. It's really trying to get some kind of collective action. You know, one person can't do very much, but a lot of people and their friends, global market economics, which is based on growth. Mm-hmm. It's the biggest monster that's ever been created. Let's cry about the state that, you know, that particular animal is, say, for example, the vaquita, and then let's get on and do whatever we can until it's too late. And we happen to be in the driver's seat as to whether it actually continues or not.
Okay, so welcome, Anthony, to the first episode of the Shades of Life podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Ingrid, and I'm honoured to be sitting in the chair as the first guest again.
So when I invited you to join the podcast as the first guest, you were truly... I couldn't imagine doing it with someone else but you, because one, I feel very comfortable with you because we've known each other for a few years now. We have collaborated on a number of creative projects together over the years, and we've been on great adventures. So as I am starting these new creative adventures with a new magazine, a new podcast, I think it's nice to just share it with you. And then you are someone with a lot of wisdom, and that's really the objective of the new podcast, to dive deeper with guests on who they are, what they do, what messages are important for them, to really share this with people and deliver a ton of value, hopefully, as part of the process. So you have one of the coolest titles ever. If people have job titles, yours, you have been dubbed the Endangered Wildlife Poet. And I can't remember how it came to be. I think a journalist called you like this at some point.
That's correct.
Yeah. So before we dive into what that means and what you do, I wanted to start by asking you to share a little bit more about your journey before you became the Endangered Wildlife Poet and before you started writing poetry, because I know you haven't always written poetry about animals. And before you did, I think you've been through a period in your life when perhaps you were not feeling completely fulfilled or satisfied. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
For sure. It's true. If we just go backwards to the 4 years previous to when I started writing this kind of poetry, I think it was 2018. I was coming out of a particular business that I thought was going to be going in a certain direction, but instead I just handed that over to somebody else and needed something to do, and just happened to stumble on a job that was, you know, the right timing. It solved a few problems for us at the front end, but as the years started to progress, it became something that was very, very dissatisfying. It was, you know, both. It was menial and it was just meaningless to me. That was the main problem, and it was, you know, quite long hours, and it was just to keep paying bills and things like that. And, you know, I think a lot of people wonder what they're doing sometimes when they're working all these hours just to pay bills and have 2 days off a week. I think that's a universal question as to whether that's a great system or not. But on top of that, it was really starting to affect me. So as I said, it started in 2018, but by the time 2021 2021 came about, then there was COVID.
Yeah.
And, so it was even worse. But the problem is some people managed to get a little bit of a break from work during COVID, but not me. I could still go every day. There was no issues with me going every day because I was living on site. So I really couldn't escape, and really had no break, and got no benefit whatsoever out of the pandemic. So I remember still going out early in the mornings, even before dark, sometime down to a local park and doing some exercising and walking and thinking, and trying to figure out where my interests really lay, so that I could start to prepare to step off into that. So I was very interested in how the human brain worked. I was very interested in humans. I read a book called *Sapiens*. Okay. And at some point I thought, well, maybe I should start thinking about something called sapienism, how to be a better human, knowing what a human is and how a human's wired and all that sort of thing. But that didn't eventuate. And then I was also involved with a men's group at that particular time. I thought, oh, well, we'll do something around trying to help other men, of a similar age to me. And but that's, went to a few meetings, but that wasn't my thing either, really. And so, I was increasingly getting quite worn down and burnt out by the job, to the point where Silvana, my wife, she knew what was happening. She knew what state I was in, and then one day she's done some life coaching. So she did a process with me, which I can't recall the name of it, but it's designed to clarify your values.
Okay.
And what's meaningful to you, and then the idea is to see if you can find a way to step into that and to pursue it. So it turned out that when we did this process, I kept on going back to, when I was 10 years old, and every weekend in the bush, trying to find bearded dragons and turtles and all this sort of thing. Had a fish tank with different fish and was down the creek catching little lobsters. Then it really, really struck me that that's where my passion had lain all that time. And stepping back a little bit, Silvana, for a couple of years, she had been contributing to ACF, Australian Conservation Foundation, because she was concerned about what was happening to Australian wildlife. But me, I was off trying to figure out what to do with my life.
Yeah.
And I remember saying, why are we paying money for this every month?
That's really funny. Yeah.
And so then it struck me. So now I always have to be very careful to remember that Silvana was really already there before I was,
I didn't know that.
My mind was everywhere. My mind was everywhere else except on what I really, really wanted to do. So we did that process, and it really just came back to me that that's what I wanted to do, was to do something to help wildlife, particularly when I saw all the stories that were coming up on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is really attached to my early story as well. I went on LinkedIn and started to connect with various people that I thought I had common interests with, and I noticed a lot of people posting about the environment, and I noticed a lot of posts about animals and the issues that they were facing. And really what happened was I started just making little comments on those, on stories that I thought I had something to say about, including a few little one-liners and little quips and things like that people used to comment about beforehand. But anyway, that's what led me to taking up the poetry, because those little statements became little sort of verse poems. Then I started expanding them, and I think I remember the first one I wrote was about a soft-shell turtle in a lake in Vietnam.
Okay.
and I would have it somewhere, but it's never been published. A lot of my early poems didn't get published. They just went out into the digital ether there on LinkedIn, and you can't really go back in LinkedIn to find them because it's so far back. Because all this started happening. I noticed. I went back, Ingrid, and had a look when we started communicating. It was in April 2021.
Yeah, that was exactly around the same time, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and in May, just around this time, next week, this time, I connected with you somewhere in May 21.
Yeah.
And very quickly we got into a few other things.
Yeah. No, I perfectly remember. I'm glad you bring it up because we did connect initially on LinkedIn, and exactly the same thing as you. I left a company I had worked for 21 years in April of that same year. And one of the first things I've done is to be active on LinkedIn again, which I had not used very much before. And the first thing I've done is to connect with a lot of people in the environmental space, the sustainability space, because I was very interested in going into this. And I really wanted to connect with like-minded people in that space. And I came across you extremely early, in the early days. And I started to see these poetry lines from you. I perfectly remember it, and I loved them. And yeah, it's almost as if we became friends from the very beginning. And I didn't know, your journey up to that point at all, but we kind of collided, when we were both taking on a different direction in our lives.
Yes, yeah, that seems very interesting and fortuitous too.
Yeah.
And I might just also mention that, where that endangered wildlife poet name came from was from Cami Kyoto from Mojo Streaming.
Oh, yes.
When they asked me to publish a poem on their platform and introduced me as the endangered wildlife poet. So I thought, well, if someone else thinks I am, then that's what I'll.
And that was a perfect title for you, I have to say. We must thank Camille for that. And she does an incredible job, by the way, for people who don't know her. I think I put a reference to what they do because they support the animal cause like nobody else. So, yeah, so thank you for sharing that story with us, Anthony. I really wanted to start with this because for people who are watching or listening, I think a lot of people can relate because we all go through difficult periods in our lives when, we reach a point when, as you said, perhaps we had a job that was paying the bills and, for all very good reasons, but it doesn't mean that we are fully satisfied and fulfilled. And I think until you actually find something that you truly love and really aligns with yourself, you have this kind of almost like hole inside. And I didn't know you had been through this exact process with your wife and that you've done like a life coaching with her, but that's really interesting. I actually have a friend who has been doing this for a while, and she's actually in Australia, and she's probably at that stage where you were, and it's exactly what you described when she's not fully happy. And she's trying to find out, what's the next step for her. So I think a lot of people will relate to what you described. What I wanted to ask you this as well, and I know it's a terrible question to ask someone, but what age were you in 2021 when this happened?
All right. Well, I turned 60 in 2019. So yeah, I was 61, 62 when all this was starting to happen. Yeah, look, I mean, age is kind of a con. It's a time con because in your head, older people will tell you this, you don't feel any different to when you're 18,
Yeah.
or, 20 or 30. There's nothing different inside your head. But every now and then you look in the mirror and say, oh, who's that guy?
Yeah,
Who's that old
apart
guy?
from the memories, yes, I agree.
So there's only an outer sort of evidence of aging, but inside it's pretty much the same, which can lead to trouble, of course, because you think you can do things that you used to do, but not quite as intensely.
Yeah, that's
But
true,
yeah, that's my vintage.
How a few things have changed.
That's my vintage, and I turned 65 last week.
That's unbelievable, and congratulations for that. I'm all about wisdom as well, and I think we don't celebrate enough, aging. It's almost as if people are against aging rather than celebrating it, and I think we should celebrate it a lot more. I wanted to ask you this question as well because for me, when I think of you and, when I've seen the work you have created these past 3 years, and I enjoy it so much, and you are so talented, and you've touched so many people, and I know you're going to continue for, many more years. It's never too late in life, to take a turn, to start something new, to start something afresh. And, it's not starting over because you always start from a certain point. But, as you say, you're still alive, and full of life. And when you have all your capacities, it's always possible to start something new, just like I'm doing with this podcast. And, I'm not 20 anymore, neither. I'm not part of the Gen Z generation, I'm Generation X, but it's always possible. I was actually looking at examples of people who have been very successful in their 60s and started in their 60s. So I've got 2 examples. Actually, one, you look a little bit like him. I was thinking about that when looking at you today. So one of the most famous examples is someone called Colonel Harland Sanders. You know who it is?
Kentucky Fried Chicken, yes.
Yes. He established his restaurant chain at age 65, which is amazing. So you see, you started earlier. And then the second example, which relates more to what you do, is Laura Ingalls Wilder. Do you know her? Laura Ingalls Wilder. She's an American author, and she wrote The Little House on the Prairie.
Oh, right. Yes, I had heard the name. Yes.
And obviously it became a very successful television series all over the world. And do you know when she started to write this series?
After 65.
At what age? 65. She started at 65. So there is hope for everybody.
Well, I've had a bit of a run up. Then you never know.
Exactly. So yeah, I really wanted to bring this up. So I think you've probably answered this question. I wanted to ask you, how did you decide to write poetry for what I call the voiceless, the animals? So that really came from your love for the animals from your childhood. You really made that link.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I started writing a series. After I did a couple of individual poems, I started writing a series, which is where Mojo Streaming came across my work, the first of those poems. And they were all based on animals that I'd seen come up on LinkedIn, someone promoting the fact that this particular animal, whatever it happened to be, was endangered. And so I wrote this series called The Tribe Endangered. And I got up to about 8 or so different animals, pangolins and orangutans and a tiny armadillo, a pink armadillo, cassowary, and the first poem, though, which also got published in the Seychelles by Nature
yes.
Seychelles, was the one about George, the giant Aldabran tortoise. And I still have contact with them, and I still
Very
make
impressive.
comments when they show some footage of George up to his old tricks. And that was where that really set the path for writing about endangered species. And the thing is, there's so many of those that there's no time to write about rabbits.
Yes.
unless it's a particularly endangered rabbit.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that, but yes, I know.
But the scary thing is, though, that you can just about choose any animal and it's heading towards being endangered. That's the biggest problem. And the research that showed in the last 50 years that the world's wildlife population has dropped 70% is really something that keeps me motivated, keeps me going, because if it dropped 50 years, if it dropped 70% in 50 years, how long is it going to take to get rid of the rest of the world's wildlife? Considering the pace of growth that's in the world and the manic obsession with growth economics, that we've got to keep growing, got to keep developing, and not understanding that that's actually destroying the life support system of the earth. So it's not really that smart. It's not really that sapient.
Yeah. It's funny because I was thinking about exactly that this morning, because I've been lucky to read one of your new poems this morning about koalas as a preview. I know you will be sharing it soon. But you made me discover quite a lot about the history of koalas, and I always love the research you put into your poems. And in this poem, you go back to the 1920s, and you mentioned that 8 million koalas have been killed, if I'm correct, which I didn't know. And, it's just made me think this morning that I don't think we realize or we remember or we measure very well enough how much animal populations have decreased. Because if we compare it was just a century ago in the 1920s, just in 100 years, and there are millions and hundreds of millions that have disappeared from the surface of the earth. And it's absolutely staggering how much populations we have lost. And I actually checked, because we know we are 8 billion people for humans on Earth today. And so you actually made me check this morning how many people were on Earth in 1920, and it was 2 billion. So in 100 years, we went from 2 billion to 8 billion. And animal population has done the exact opposite, have gone the exact opposite trend, which is really interesting. And as you say, humanity has developed a lot, but we've lost a lot from the animal kingdom at the same time.
Exactly. I mean, they're the sort of things that keep me going, just trying to raise the red flag that things are not okay with our current trajectory. Things are definitely not okay.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that, when you were looking for new purpose in your life, you were looking for meaning. And I suppose you find that meaning by supporting more endangered animals, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. That in that sense, the meaning is the sort of compulsion to do something to contribute to something positive in the world.
Yeah,
I think that's what meaning is really about. I don't. It's whether you can make a difference, and it's still a small difference if you look at the number of followers on a social media thing or the number of people you actually engage with. It's certainly still only very small, but if there's a couple of people who are affected, and people share stuff that you write, and amongst their networks, you just don't know where it's going. So
I think it starts with you anyway. The meaning starts with you, right? Because then that's the best of what you can share. Okay, so one question I also wanted to ask you, because obviously you are focusing very much on writing as a creative medium. Has writing always been part of your life? Have you been writing throughout your life, or is it something you kind of rekindled with when you started writing poetry?
Looking back, just recently with the episode with packing up my father's house so that he could go into aged care, I came across a few things. I came across a book I won when I was 10 or 11, an essay competition about why grow trees. Unfortunately, in those days, you wrote something, you sent it away, and you'd never see it again. If you didn't have carbon paper to make a copy. So there's no copy of it, but I got the book with the little plaque in the front from the Lions Club, saying, congratulations on your thing there. So I had some capability when I was younger, and at school, even from a young age, I was always interested in language.
Yeah.
But there's no other sort of episodes of writing until until the love poems started coming in a bit later on. But apart from that, there was nothing else except one other thing I thought about when I saw when I think about this. At university, when I went back to university in 1988, again at my wife's insistence and studied journalism because because she thought I was a good writer, but I wasn't really right. I wasn't really right.
Your wife played an important role here.
So I went back to university, studied journalism, and one of the subjects was creative writing. And I remember writing a poem for one of the lecturers. And I remember the first sort of line. He said, I can't really remember what it was about. But he said, there is talent here, but be careful if you set up a pattern coming down and then you change it, it drives people crazy. And guess what? That's how I write now. Exactly what he told me not to do.
Yeah.
I'll throw a couple of rhyming things in here, and then I'll go off and I'll say, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I just throw little bits and pieces in as they come up, because if you're going to be true to the creative process, I'm not manufacturing anything. I'm just getting out the thoughts that are in my head, and opinions and my views and that kind of thing. So I usually don't structurally change poems from the way that they appear in my head and start to flow, except when I'm doing them for somebody else, and that's a different process altogether.
Yeah, I've witnessed that, but I think that's a good way of working, because I think
it is.
Yeah, to be truly creative, you need to find that flow and not feel forced, So I think that's a really good way to work. So going back to being an endangered wildlife poet, can you explain to us what is your mission? If someone, perhaps younger or perhaps your age, wanted to do your job, can you tell us a little bit about what does it consist of? What's your process? How do you go about it?
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to mind there is the I guess on the website, which we're going to talk about a bit later on. I did write a poem I've only ever entered one poem in a contest and I didn't get anywhere, but it turned out that was my mission. That was the poem called The 1 Million, which we'll talk about a bit later on. And in there, I talk about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And it's really trying to get some kind of collective action. One person can't do very much, but a lot of people and their friends can do a lot if they're doing the right thing. And I talk about a rescue rope because wildlife is in trouble and it needs rescuing, and it needs a lot of people to to get them back to safety. And so that's part of my mission, is to try and get other people to have us to think about the importance of wildlife in their own life and in the survival of the planet. I think it's also encapsulated in the no-go logo that you and I are very familiar with, which is the logo of the 1 million and those 8 or 9 critically endangered animals, nearly all going the wrong way. And so the mission is to try to get them to turn back from heading, what I say in another poem, in a conga line, heading towards extinction, and we need to get them to turn back. And that's my mission, is really just to get people to think about what's happening and make their contribution to ensure that it doesn't happen. That wildlife doesn't completely disappear from this planet, because there's not many decades after that humans can survive.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this poem, The 1 Million, and because it's actually perhaps my favorite of yours. I always loved it. I love the reference to the rope. I just think, it is words, but, I'm a very visual person, and I can totally visualize what you mean as I read the poem. And it is so well written. That's probably the best mission statement I've ever read in my life, truly. So
Yes.
that's a good way to explain your job, that's for sure.
Yeah, I know there's a reference in there, one line that says, "Hold on to hope as you would a rescue rope." That came from the fact that the first things that I was writing in parallel to the endangered species was a series on hope, because I'd seen at least 2 people in the eco space saying, "I don't see any hope anymore. I think it's hopeless." And so I explored that in a series of about 7 poems, big arc of looking for hope, and I never published it, and I never finished it, because I think it's turned full circle. You've got to have grounds for hope, and it's the ground's pretty shaky at the moment, which means you then have to redouble your efforts to make sure that we don't lose that ground for hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're very right. I have seen this on social media so many times, people working in the environmental space, and it is true that the word hope comes back very often. I think, you do need, to find optimism, or at least to find something to grab, like your rope, to really, fight for something. And I think wildlife is worth fighting for. I mean, that's one of the best things to fight for, that for sure. So we mentioned your website. So you have an online platform called the 1millionpoetry.com, and we are both very familiar with it because we've worked on it together. So you use the 1millionpoetry.com to share your poems, so people can check it out. Can you tell people watching today, where did the idea of creating the 1 million poetry come from, and why the 1 million?
Okay, I remember very clearly reading that story when it first came out in 2019.
Yeah.
From the IPBES report, and I can never get it right, Intergovernmental Panel for something or other.
It's long.
Ecosystem something. Anyway, people can look it up. Well, it's actually on my website, isn't it? And in that, they said if humans continued on their current trajectory, and this was 2019, before the pandemic, then up to 1 million species could be at risk of extinction. Now, one species going extinct is not good, and nobody really knows what happens if one species becomes extinct for no good reason. I mean, just because we made it extinct, and all the connections it has to other ecology and how that ripples through. No one even knows what one what effect one has, let alone 1 million. And yes, they were talking about large animals, and they were talking down to plants and fungi and all that sort of stuff. But 1 million is a very big number, and I was obsessed with 1 million in the beginning, trying to explain to people how big 1 million is.
Yeah.
Because if someone said, you want $1 million? I say, yeah, great.
Yes.
I mean, give me $1 million, give me 2 million, I'm happy. But they don't really understand how big 1 million is. And so anyway, I was obsessed with that idea of the 1 million. I wrote lots of poems about how to describe what 1 million was, including if you lined up one endangered species every metre, then in 1 kilometre you'd have 1,000, only 1,000. So you have to walk 1,000, you have to walk 1,000 kilometres to get to 1 million animals every 1 metre. So that starts to make you realise how big it is. So that was in my mind, and when we were having our exchanges about creating something, that's what was really sort of standing out. The fact that it's a big number, and it's an unacceptable number, and it's probably an understatement.
Yeah.
And I think I've actually seen people come back and say, oh no, it's going to be worse than that. If this Anthropocene episode, extinction event, continues to unfold, and it is unfolding. It's a human caused extinction event, mass extinction event, whereas all the others in the past, and there've been five of them, I think.
Yeah.
We're all from natural causes and bad luck.
Yeah.
And nasty plants, one of them apparently. When the plants started to develop on Earth without ahead of animals, they created all sorts of havoc and changed the chemistry of the ocean and caused 90% of all life to die out. And then the things that came on land and started eating plants sorted things out again eventually.
Yeah, that's really interesting also what you said, because there are 1 million species at risk of extinction, both plants and animals. And of course, you could argue everyone is important, and it's also the law of natural law, I don't know how to say, that some species will disappear, but the rate at which we are seeing the extinction of species has increased exponentially, dramatically, and it's not normal, that's for sure. And then within the species that are disappearing, as you mentioned very rightly, there could be very key species. If they disappear, it's like a domino effect. It's like the keystone in a building. If you remove it, the whole building collapses. And we don't know, even scientists today can't tell exactly or pinpoint exactly, if this species disappears, is it the one? Just like the reverse is true, I've heard many scientists, talk about, which of these species could potentially help save us. There has been a lot of discussions about whales, because they have such a big role about carbon capture that we know they are an important animal on the planet, also considering the challenges we have today with carbon emissions, for example. So that's really interesting discussions in that space.
Yes.
So continuing the conversation on your mission with the 1 million poetry, the way you describe your mission or your objectives is actually very original. When I came across it, when we first met 3 years ago, I thought it was very original, because you talk of creating a sacro sanctuary on Earth. So can you explain to people what that means?
Yes, in that poem, Sacrosanct, was one that I wrote at some point. I don't remember starting to write it, but often
I remember it was something very, very important to you, because you would always go back to that word. So
yeah. It I just remember, the the first verse, I hold this to be true, life is sacred, other life too. That was the first thing that came to me. And often a poem, if you saw my notes, you'll see lots of 2-line or 3-line or 4-line things that come up. That the beginnings of poems. I don't know where they're going after that. But I do know that there's something in that. That's like the seed. And then you water it and give it a little bit of time, and it starts to grow. So this poem came about and went in directions that I wasn't particularly comfortable with, because it was kind of an exploration of things that I have. I don't like to use the word believed, but let's just say believed in the past, and so it's lots of imagery from different cultures and things like that. But so I thought it could be open to misinterpretation in some ways, but it's not. What the point of it was that every single atom of ours, or every single gene actually, is pretty much the same as all the genes in all the other life on this planet. We're all related. Everything is related. It all came from some incident somewhere, on a thermal vent somewhere in the ocean, or in a rock pool beside the ocean, a little chemical factory that sparked life, which still is. There's still differing opinions on how it actually happened, but it happened because we have the evidence. And so therefore anything that goes extinct now, that's the end of a chain that goes back for 4 billion years.
Yeah.
And remember the very simple cyanobacteria and stuff like that, they just ruled the earth for 1 billion years or whatever it was, just being bacteria before it started to organize more complex and all that sort of thing. So everything is related, and everything can trace its existence back then. If something dies without a new generation, without creating new life, which is one of the two drivers that I recognize in nature, then that's the end of it. It's the end of a chain. It's finished. And to me, that's intensely sad. It's really incredibly sad if it happens for no good reason. Of course, nature doesn't have that awareness of, an animal just went extinct over there because it wasn't actually that good. It couldn't adapt fast enough to the changing circumstances and, this and that and the other thing. That happens. Background extinction happens all the time. Natural extinction, as you said, happens all the time. But what bothers me the most is that all the extinctions we're having now were and may still be avoidable. And that's the whole factor of being able to avoid it. So if that's the case, I went straight to, life may only exist on this planet, even though there's billions of other planets that could support life. We'll probably never know, because we won't. The distances are too vast, and the technology is too difficult to be able to really get there. We might be able to find out whether there's life on Europa or something like that around Saturn, some moons and things like that, but other planets are a long, long way out. So as far as we know, and I use that term a lot, we're the only planet with life in the whole universe. However it started, by divine intervention, by accident, by mistake, it doesn't really matter. It's here.
Yeah.
And it could be the only one. And so, the way I see the Earth itself is a sanctuary.
It is precious, isn't it? Yeah.
In a cold universe, I say. It's a sanctuary, and so that's where the idea of the sanctuary came from. But then I thought, well, that's not really enough. We have to really try and push it as high as you can. And so, this, to me, one way of ensuring that life continues on this planet is to say, well, if the whole Earth is a sanctuary, then all life should also be protected within that sanctuary, which means you you don't have the right to clear habitats and kill whales and dolphins and kangaroos and all that sort of thing. You've got to make some way of sharing that sanctuary, because it's a sanctuary for us too. This is the thing we have to understand. Earth is a sanctuary for us too. And unless we want it to become an artificial environment place with artificial food, like some dead satellite that we've somehow managed to, keep alive on through technology, then we need to keep the existing life support systems going. And those life support systems were created by nature, by life. Life created the life support systems for itself. And at the moment, we're meddling with the life support system of the planet, and that's not really sensible. So what I said there is, well, let's take it even further. Let's take it up a notch and say that this life is sacred. So it's a sacred sanctuary, which means it's sacrosanct. You can't mess with it. You can't just go in and do your own thing and do whatever you like and treat other species as if they belong to you, or they're expendable, or they're just a resource. So that's where the whole idea came from, for the sacrosanctuary, a sacred sanctuary, the only sanctuary planet that we know of, and we happen to be here, and we happen to be in the driver's seat as to whether it actually continues or not.
That's a beautiful explanation. It is true, there is a lot of sadness with everything we see happening with animal treatment, but we'll talk about that a little more. I wanted to ask you if you focus more on certain animals than others for your poetry. Is it like a choice, a conscious choice to focus on certain animals more than others?
In the beginning, as I said, I started out with just endangered animals. Now I particularly try to stick with critically endangered animals. So those that have less than 300.
Okay.
And then there are some of the less, like northern right whales, which I haven't written about, less than 300, or less than 100, like maybe only 50 to 70, Sumatran rhinos, which we're aware of. It's in the logo. And of course, animals that are in the final stages of their evolutionary time on Earth, like the vaquita, the smallest cetacean, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later on. And also I wrote that poem also nearly probably a year ago, Into the White, about the northern white rhino, when the last male northern white rhino died.
Such a
sad
story.
He left two daughters, but humans at least are trying to ensure that genetic heritage of the northern white rhino can continue through an artificial breeding program. They have some embryos, and they have implanted at least one, but that wasn't successful when the mother died. So anything like that, any final last stand battle, I'm happy to write about. And like even the logo, even the mascot of the 1 million, the northern hairy-nosed wombat.
Yes.
There's about 315.
Yeah, it's not a lot. Yeah. It's
No, and it went down to about 35, and so that's a classic case of we caused the problem, and we can hopefully turn it around through breeding programs and conservation, and in this particular case, fenced conservation areas, because they lost a few to wild dogs when breeding them up again. So there's so many stories, but I like to tell, these poems are little stories, but they're also snapshots of what I was thinking at a particular time. So, I generally, if I look back at a poem and say, oh, I don't really think that anymore, you don't go back and tear up old photos, although I do know somebody who does. Not you. rather forgetting old times. But yeah, I tend to just say, well, that's how I was thinking at the time, and there's new things coming all the time, and new ways of looking at things.
I think also it's a really beautiful homage, sorry. It's a beautiful homage that you're giving to species that, are on the brink of extinction, like literally, because, it would just be easy to ignore them, they could just be ignored. But through your writing, you're leaving a trace, because we don't know what will happen to them. Will they make it or not? It is very sad stories. I mean, every time you write about a species that is, almost gone, yeah, it is difficult. Yeah. So that brings us to my next question, because you tell very touching animal stories in your poems. And over the years, since you started writing, we have seen that one common effect that your poems can have on people is actually to make them cry. And I think there is a line on your website about it, a quote from you. So I wanted to ask you if you could share with us a couple of animal stories that you have covered, perhaps in the last couple of years or in the past 3 years, that you think everybody should know about.
Yeah, well, I guess carrying on from that answer about the animals that were less than 100 and less than 30, and even more alarming when there's less than that. The Into the White is the poem I mentioned before. That's an example, certainly an example of that. The Sumatran rhino is another one, which we do have, because it's in the no-go logo. I have written a little bit about the Sumatran logo there, about the Sumatran rhino there, but I also wrote another one, which is not published on the website. Early in the piece about the Sumatran rhino, and they're still just holding on. The main problem there being habitat fragmentation. Their last places where they can live, people want to grow, crops there, and they want to grow palm oil and all that sort of stuff. And I've actually started another poem at the moment where I tackle that issue of, the animal can only be an animal, and it can only do what that animal does, and it can only live where that animal lives. Whereas a human who is going in to destroy that animal's habitat could do 100 other jobs. That's one of the benefits of being human.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing a poem about that at the moment, and it's another front I want to open up to try and get people to say, well, maybe it's not a great idea to be a person who clears forests, for a wood chip that were koala habitats or orangutan habitats or whatever it happens to be. And so I've got a list of ones that I'm working through, and there's quite a few there. So I guess and this is where we get into dangerous territory here, because I remember the when I did an interview with Mojo Streaming, and the poor interviewer, whose name just escapes me at the moment, I'll remember it when I'm not trying to remember it. We were talking about this sort of stuff, and we got onto the subject of the vaquita. And I got emotional about it. She got emotional about it, and there was this emotional pause in the podcast. So be careful.
Yeah.
But one of the things about the vaquita is that I've written about it a lot. I wrote Valet Vaquita when I saw that it was pretty well curtains for them.
Yeah.
But then I wrote, I've written other ones when I see people trying to do things about it. And vaquita is the smallest cetacean, the smallest dolphin in the world, porpoise, I can't remember, in the Gulf of Mexico. it's a victim of bycatch, mainly for the trade in a certain totoaba fish bladder that is fished illegally in the Gulf. They get caught in the nets, and that's what's decimated the population. And then that's sold. There's big money in it, so there's organized crime involved in it, and then it goes to Asia, where it's a delicacy. So the demand creates the supply and creates extinction. And it is one of the big problems that I have, that you can tackle it at the end where they're actually causing the extinction by fishing, by hunting, by clearing habitat. But that's not what's actually causing it. What's causing it is the demand. And I've seen a few people with regard to climate change getting on, becoming shareholders in the big companies and forcing them off certain issues and causing shareholder revolts and things like that. And I think I really applaud that kind of thing. But you have to do it at both ends. So my end is the sad end, and I try to get people to have that emotional response, because I do, and I don't want to do it just me. I want other people to feel what I feel. And so that line, I make people cry while their tears still have potency, comes from, as you know, the poem Preemptive Lacrimation, which basically says, let's get the crying out of the way now. Let's learn what the issue is. Let's cry about the state that that particular animal is, say, for example, the vaquita, and then let's get on and do whatever we can until it's too late.
Yeah.
And it's only too late when the last one. Well, that's not exactly true, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, of course.
Until they're extinct. Me personally, I can talk about it now because the poems I've written. Even last night, someone on LinkedIn reshared a poem called Small Wonder. And it was a poem I wrote after, or just before I found out that there had been another survey of vaquitas in the Gulf, and they found that there were 13, including a calf. So there was, and so because of that story, I wrote a poem called Glimmer Vaquita, like a glimmer of hope. And the light glimmering off the back of the young vaquita. But this one I wrote beforehand, again, another one trying to get people to understand that Mexico needs to do something about the illegal fishing, and they are, but they have to do it much more. If they don't want it to go extinct, it has to be emergency action. Like they have to have patrol boats out there, getting these illegal fishers, catching them and getting them out. I think they also put down snags on the bottom of the bay, that snag nets in certain areas so that fishermen can't do it. But at least that's, there has been effort, and there has been millions and millions of dollars.
The problem of fishing nets. So
anyway, my point is that if people read that poem, they'll understand what that means. It does make you upset, it does make you teary, but while there's life, there's hope, is the old saying. You've got to just keep hammering away, and if more and more people are doing it, and they are, because there's even an International Vaquita Day, and there's only maybe 13 of them in the world. And so there are organizations trying to do things. There are people around the world trying to do things. So whenever I write something, I'm trying to refer to what people are doing. And you might have seen a post going around by a guy called Glenn Satsing or something like, I can't remember his actual spelling of his surname. He's trying to sort of promote this thing about humans rethinking what they are and how they're organized. But he says the best predictor of hope is action. And I think it's a pretty good statement. It's a pretty good rock solid statement. Crying is one thing, but action is better.
Like everything else in life. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to bring up another animal story, because when I think of all the poems you've created that I have read, Probably one of the stories I have found the most touching is the story of Happy the elephant. Can you tell people a little bit about that one? Because just thinking about it now, like I could cry, like I could literally cry.
Yes, there's one of the issues I tackle, and a lot. So they don't get published on LinkedIn because there's too many. So they don't get published on my website. There's too many. Website would have too many poems, so I just put them out there on LinkedIn. And there's Happy is an elephant in the US, but there's also Lucy I've written about in Edmonton in Canada. There's also Shankar, an African elephant in India. There's some that have been saved. There's one called Nosy, and that Nosy was, people were all around the world trying to save Nosy, get her out of the zoo and into sanctuary, and that eventually happened. And so it can happen.
Yeah.
So small victories, but yes, I wrote that poem, Happy, not Happy, whatever it was, about Happy the elephant, who has been something like 50, well, a long time, 50 years might be Lucy in the Edmonton Zoo. I get them a bit confused, there's so many. But the most interesting thing about Happy is that she has an advocate, not just an organisation of people trying to keep the awareness going to get them released. But there's a project called the Non-Human Rights Project, and it was headed by a man called Stephen Wise, who sadly died recently. And I wrote another poem after that in his honour. But the Non-Human Rights Project is trying all around the world, whether it's with chimpanzees or elephants in this particular case, which happen to be two of the ones that I promote, with the third one being cetaceans. They actually took Happy's case to court to say that Happy is not a thing that can be kept in a zoo. Happy has rights as a sentient being. She has rights not to be imprisoned, because the zoo is a prison for an elephant. Because elephants in the wild have vast ranges and migration routes and things like that. So it doesn't matter how big the zoo is. It's nothing compared to what a wild elephant would experience. And in a lot of cases, like in the Bronx Zoo, where Happy is, they're only very small areas, or even in India, Edmonton Zoo, they're all very, very small areas, often with hard stand. And elephants have very sensitive feet that are meant to feel vibrations in the earth of other elephants, from a distance. So they really need to be not kept in captivity, except maybe in breeding programs when, if the forest elephants keep disappearing at the stage they are now, a subspecies of African elephant, then maybe breeding programs need to be established, in some zoos, but not with a view to breeding them for other zoos so that people can go and look at them in a zoo. To me, a breeding program has to be about rewilding, getting them back into their habitat. The problem being, of course, the habitat might not be there anymore.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing is fraught with difficulties, but keeping an animal in a zoo for decades, and it's happened to orcas as well. There's a story I'm going to tell about one of her names was Lolita, but it was another native name she had as well, that died recently after 50 years in a tank, just when they were about to move her.
Oh.
And so that one's a particularly sad one. So that's the problem, keeping animals for no good reason. That, often they say it comes from a different type of thinking. When colonial people went out and thought, oh, these are animals we've never seen before, let's bring them back home and show the people, and they become
yeah, there is a history. Yeah,
a big marvel about what's happening in the world. And then later on, yeah, they were supposed to be ambassadors for the species and things like that. But you know, when something becomes a money-making venture based on the captivity of an animal, then so I have big problems with that. Not so with breeding programs for conservation, but beyond that, there's some issues that I have. So yeah, happy the elephant has been in there for a long time. Her case went to court based around habeas corpus, that she has, you know, that she has a body, that is, that she's a sentient being. It went to the court and it failed, but a couple of the judges were on the side, apparently, and so they took it as a step in a victory towards it. And then you know, I wrote a poem after it failed because I wasn't happy. Maybe I shouldn't publish that one again. But it's just a stepping stone. You know, the next step will be to find another way to get the animals out there. And I know that's one of my things which we'll talk about later. Is I have a hashtag which is recognition of species, and that is recognizing the sentience and the rights of elephants and great apes and cetaceans. Just as a start, there'll be others, but let's start somewhere, and let's just say those are fellow species that people should not be free to keep in captivity or murder, or force them out of house and home. So yeah, that's the story of Happy. It's a kind of watch this space. There are sanctuaries ready to take these elephants. There's one in Tennessee that has some very happy elephants that have been sent to sanctuary, and it's better than much more north, where it's colder. So anyway, that's one of the poems that I wrote about, and there'll be others in that vein of not supporting any industry that has captive animals for no good purpose, other than making money.
Yeah, no, thank you for giving us these explanations. I'm also asking because, you know, we live at a time when we know we probably need to repopulate animal populations. And there are these particular cases of one animal that make it to the media, obviously. And, you know, you would think that one elephant that has been in captivity for 50 years, it would be obvious that, yes, let's send this elephant, you know, let's make this elephant retire in a sanctuary so that he can finish, you know, his life as happy as possible, as the name, you know, indicates. It's also the name of the elephant is Happy, and you imagine perhaps he's not that happy. But even that, we as humans seem to not be able to, you know, go through the heaviness of, you know, administration and laws. And we are talking of one elephant who has been in captivity for 50 years, and we are not even able to send him, you know, to a sanctuary. And I just find it incredible. Absolutely
yes.
amazing in a negative way, you know. So
in certain cases, for example, Lucy in Edmonton, they say that, you know, she's old and she's got health problems, and she wouldn't survive the trip to the sanctuary. But it's my way of thinking, even if she died along the way, at least it was something. At least it was something. Or at least it was outside the walls that she'd known for that time. And even if she only had a couple of weeks, couple of months, maybe a year or two with other elephants, then, you know, supposedly elephants have long memories, but they could make new memories in their final days. I think that's a nice thing. And in Thailand, there's an elephant sanctuary run by Lek Chalet, very famous, and she's only a tiny Thai person, and she's always got these big elephants around her, and they love her, and they've got a river, and they've got a forest, and they've got big open fields, and you know, it's a sanctuary for the elephants that have been rescued from hard labor, or festival elephants and things like that. So there are people doing really good stuff, and there are sanctuaries where they should go. We just have to develop the pressure on the people to say this is an old idea.
Absolutely.
Keep elephants captive. We have to get rid of old ideas and replace them with new.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Anthony, sometimes we forget that we humans are part of the animal kingdom, and I'm sure some people would argue about that, but let's not go there. We even share more than 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, which is the animal of predilection of one of my personal heroes, Jane Goodall. You will certainly know her. She's a world-renowned English primatologist and anthropologist. So I wanted to ask you, how would you wish to see the human-wildlife connection evolve moving forward? Because at the end of the day, they are our cousins as well. And I think you explained that really well.
Yeah. The way I see it, in most cases of human-wildlife conflict, it's because the humans are out of place. They are encroaching on the habitat of the animals, whether it's in Africa and elephants, putting roads and railways and villages and fields across ancient migration routes. Happens in India, it happens in Sri Lanka with elephants, fragmenting their habitat. It is human-wildlife conflict because it's humans that are causing the conflict. It happens with snow leopards in the Himalayas as well. People bring their flocks up to the area where that's the habitat of the snow leopard, and the snow leopard says, "Oh, this sheep's a bit slower than the blue sheep, so we'll eat it instead." You see it all over the world. You see it. One of the big problems that that people have in Europe and the US with wolves and rewilding wolves is that they supposedly take their livestock and yeah, why wouldn't you? It's because the livestock is on the ancient ranges of an ancient habitat of those species, and if we reintroduce them, then there's still going to be that potential for conflict. So there has to be new ways of looking at it, and new ways of avoiding it as much as possible. But in the end, when there's human-wildlife conflict, it's inevitably the animals that lose, because humans are just an overwhelming force on this planet. The only way I can see that it's going to be able to progress back in the right direction is habitat protection. So whatever habitat is still there, it really needs to be a priority to make sure that it stays there and that those animals get to stay in their own habitat. And then, if a human wanders into their habitat and has conflict, well, whose fault is that? And there kind of has to be, in my mind, a demarcation. You have to say that area is for conservation, habitat conservation, and you don't put your fields in there, you don't put your stock in there, you don't do all that sort of stuff. It's just, and that's the reason I wrote the poem 50-50.
Oh, yeah.
Where I talked about, there's a whole movement that says, well, there's a movement I saw on LinkedIn that talks about, say, protecting 30% of the world's wild areas by 2030. And while I think that's good, while I think it's a good start, I don't see how anyone can say that we even know that's enough. That's a good start. So that's why I wrote 50-50. And then I found out that there's actually an organization that's promoting 50-50, 50% of the earth for human, 50% of the earth for humans, one species, and 50% for the other 8 million, 10 million, whatever else it happens to be. To me, that sounds like a pretty good deal for us. not for the animals, but at least we can ensure that half of the biosphere will be functioning the way that it should be, the way that it's evolved to function. So habitat protection, human wildlife conflict is all about habitat protection and making areas off limits to humans, stopping the mad development, the mad clearing in the Amazon, in the forests of Indonesia, which are still being cleared at an alarming rate. There's no hope if there's no habitat.
Yeah, very true. The habitat is one of the most important thing for wildlife. You're very right. So I think we are going to go back to a few things we've mentioned, but I wanted to bring this up because it happens. I actually have an article at the moment on Scarlet Thread magazine about regreening cities. I had some guests and we actually did a podcast about the importance of regreening our cities. But as part of the research we did, we saw that over half of the population today live in cities, and it is projected to be 70% by 2050, which is quite massive. And when we look at the issues that wildlife face, as you've just mentioned, urbanization and the growth of urbanization and the need for lands, puts a lot of pressure on animal habitats. And that's certainly one of the biggest threats that they face today. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the biggest threats to the animal kingdom today? Obviously, habitat loss. I think you've mentioned the problem of fishing nets for animals living in the oceans.
Yes, of course. The two big ones, which are even dwarfed by the third one, which I just thought of, and I hope I remember it when I come back to it. Obviously, climate change, and climate change has captured people's imagination because it really affects people. When their house gets flooded, when their town gets burnt down, when there are mega fires, when we weren't mega fires before. I'm just watching the magpie geese, a big flock of magpie geese.
Yeah, we can see that. We can hear the birds. Yeah,
they're just coming over because we had some rain and the wetlands are filled up again. That's what I love about living here. There's still wildlife I can see out my window or in my yard. Anyway, climate change, young people get it. They understand, and they're trying to sort of reorganize things. But there's another one that's now coming up to be glued to that. It's the other side of the coin, and that's biodiversity loss, which comes back to that habitat loss, which then comes back to where is the habitat being lost and why. A lot of it, as I said, is because of certain industries, beef industry, palm oil, mining, especially now there's a whole new front being opened up, mining for minerals that are needed for an alternative energy future is destroying forests in South America and in Indonesia. There are big problems that we've got to try and figure out how to do these problems without destroying biodiversity. Biodiversity is the life support system of this planet, and we've got to get that message out there. Anyone who's messing with that, you should take their company down. You just, don't. Demand is what keeps these companies going. If they're making money, they'll keep doing it. If they can't take the heat and they can't make money, they will not do it anymore. And that's basically what it is. Plastics is a very big issue, of course. I've written a poem about plastics. And I also covered that topic a little bit in my second coffee poem. When I talked about always remains, that people like the plastics industry say, oh, we can make plastics and we can sell it. And it's someone else's problem then. It's the people's problem, and they say, oh, we don't like it. It becomes the ocean's problem. It becomes a problem on nature. It always ends up back on nature, when what should have happened in the beginning is that the full environmental cost of dealing with whatever you manufacture should have been factored in. It'd be way more expensive, and therefore people wouldn't buy so much of it, and they wouldn't use it to destroy the earth. So, if someone manufactures something, my attitude is they should always be responsible for it to come back, in closed loop, or to go into new products, or to go into compost, into fertilizer, something like that. But they should not be allowed to, I can manufacture something and it's somebody else's problem. For example, tires. I saw the other day a story about tires on cars. There's a tire dump in South Australia, and there's all problems with it because no one wants responsibility for it now. It's got millions of tires piled up. To me, I would send them back to the manufacturer and bury the factory in those tires to stop them manufacturing more, or figure out a way of dealing with it.
Yeah.
So that's what I get at when I say always remain. And this is an interesting story. When I was younger, I was going around one time. We had an old truck on a farm, and we picked up a couple of pallets we saw lying around, looked like junk. And one of them had this phrase on it: always remains the property of CHEP, the company that manufactured it.
Yeah.
So when we were driving through town, a CHEP truck went past, pulled us up. He went and got the pallet and put it in his own truck and said, "This is our property." They looked after it because it was their property. Always remains is something that I want to sort of try and push a bit more as one of those things in the environmental
That's a
space.
really nice idea. Yeah. And we see that across industries, fashion, etc. Yeah.
Yes. Put the problem back on the manufacturers, not the consumers, and that's kind of a reset. Anyway, that's getting off the subject.
No, that's great.
Problem.
And I'm so glad you brought these topics up, like climate change, deep sea mining, plastic pollution. And you made me think of something because last year I did some work for an Australian wildlife festival, and as part of it, I did a collaboration with a British Australian scientist whom you know, Dr. Stephen Ambrose. And we did some work on 10 Australian endemic Australian species that are at risk of extinction. And we covered the different threats that they face, so all of the 10. And one threat that came through very strongly is climate change. And, in the past, urbanization was already a threat. Sickness, disease was a threat, obviously. But we keep piling up, you add climate change, you add plastic pollution, you add deep sea mining now, we keep piling up the threats and the risks that animals are facing. And how do you want them to cope? How fast do you want them to adapt to these threats? And it has real consequences for these species.
Yes, yeah, and that brings me to my final point, which I thought of and I have written about, but not published, and that is the biggest problem that we really have, which is causing all of these other problems, is the market economics that we have. The global market economics, which is based on growth. Mm-hmm. It's the biggest monster that's ever been created, and if it isn't tackled, it'll end up destroying itself, which is a kind of a weird thing. And so you've probably seen the tattoo that some people have and the symbol that some people have, a serpent swallowing its own tail in a circle. And I've written a poem on that, and I call it the market monster, and it needs slaying. And it's going to take a lot to slay it. And it's everything that happens, every problem we've got with wildlife comes down to the fact that people buy something that someone can make money out of by destroying wildlife habitat. And this consciousness of, the provenance of your spending or the consequence of your spending is going to have to really be pushed what am I really buying? Am I buying the destruction of habitat? It's not the product I bought. It's,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think of, I avoid palm oil, and even so-called responsible palm oil, because it's a culpable industry in terms of biodiversity loss. But it's insidious. So I wrote a poem called Insidious, not about the horror movie, but about a real horror movie, which was palm oil. And it's in all this food that you buy, and you didn't even realize it was in there. But when you buy it, you've paid someone to clear rainforests that was orangutan habitat. So I think consumers have to become very aware of their own consumption and what they're consuming and how they're consuming. Excuse me. And I think that's the space you're working in a lot now, isn't it, Ingrid?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thankfully, there are people, there are brands who are tackling not only tackling these issues and changing their ingredients, but also making people aware of the issues. And, we need more and more brands to do that, for sure. Yeah, I'm thinking of the wife of a friend who works for a company making a well-known nut butter product, and it's sold in the UK and probably in other countries. And they are very vocal about not using palm oil, and they have done various campaigns. And that's what we need to see, people who advocate against and, who come with different formulas that don't harm the planet or wildlife.
Yes, as long as we don't create another problem by solving one, which is a human habit. We got a problem, so you create a forever chemical to solve the problem, and then you've got a problem forever.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, very good point. So, going back to something you mentioned earlier, which is animal rights, because there are clearly more and more discussions around animal rights. I think we have started to reach that point, especially in the conservation space, when people start to think, well, perhaps, one of the solutions to help wildlife is to give them rights. And for example, there is an organization called Conservation International, and especially the Pacific branch of this organization is very active. And they, through their work, whales and dolphins now have legal personhood in the Pacific, which means that they are officially recognized as legal persons. So it's the same between, harming someone, you or me, or someone harming a whale or a dolphin. So obviously it is limited to the Pacific region. But because there are all of these discussions around personhood, I wanted to ask you your opinion about it. Is it something you advocate for?
Well, absolutely. And you would know from our 3-year association that I think when I even met you, I already had the tag recognition of species.
Yeah.
I was tagging a lot of my stuff, whenever something came up about dolphins or gorillas or elephants, I would always use the tag recognition of species. And then I was very, very happy to see those Pacific chiefs and nations take that first step. And if that goes all around the world, then whaling ends. Those 2 or 3 countries that still do whaling, that would end. The indigenous people who rely on that sort of stuff, that's another discussion and something that they will look at in due course. But industrial scale whaling, like in Iceland and Norway and Japan, you can't go out murdering during this whaling seasons. So I want to see, I think it's incredibly significant, and I couldn't support it more, and I will be writing poems about it because it's exactly the turning point that we've been looking for, and then hopefully great apes, and elephants as well, because elephants live in a very similar society to humans. In fact, they probably raise their children a lot better than we do. With aunties, with lots of aunties and things like that. So
yeah, there are still societies doing this. I was actually reading an article about it this morning. That's funny. Yeah. Okay, so let's hope we are going to see a lot more of that in the future. So you have obviously become an important and original voice for the animals through the art of poetry. Going back to our discussion from the beginning of this conversation, how important has it become for you personally in your life to write about animals? Obviously, it's important for the animal cause, but for you personally, how important is it?
Yes, it is. I mean, I actually wrote a bit of a story about something once, a blog, when I did do a bit of writing for something, and it was about, there's a saying that on a tombstone somewhere, that was this man, his name, and he was born a man but died a grocer. And what that was is the opposite. It's sort of saying, well, we're not our profession. We're humans. And I still subscribe to that, except, if I say I am an endangered species poet, well, I don't make a livelihood out of it, so it's not a job, is it really? But it is a part of my identity. And so identity is an important thing that humans do. Obviously, when you look at how humans grow up, and when they get to certain ages, they want to, what am I? And what kind of human am I? What sort of identity am I? What sort of youth culture thing am I going to follow? And then, of course, as you get older, some people grow out of that, others don't. It is a part of your identity and a part of your values system. So it's hard to take it out. And in that sense, I have a different job, which I still just do to pay bills, but only part-time now. And I don't like it. But because I have this other interest in my life now, which I didn't have 4 years ago, I can escape into what I consider to be my real life. When I'm at work, that's not my real life at all. That's just something I have to do. But my real life is, particularly when Silvana is at work, drop her off at 7 o'clock and I can come home and go for a walk on the beach and go into town, have a coffee, write a poem, observe nature, on my way in and on my way out, which is, I know how privileged I am to live where I do, which is kind of a small urban area, but there's still plenty of wildlife around in close areas, and that's my passion. That's what I love. I've loved it since I can, as early as I can remember.
That's great to hear, and really glad that it's making you truly happy. That's great to hear. So I also wanted to ask you, because you've obviously you've been very prolific since you started writing poetry about 3 years ago. I wanted to ask you, what poetry projects have you created or taken part to, because you've been involved in a number of collaborations. Which project have you perhaps been the most proud of? If you had to pick one.
Well, I already can't pick one, so but I'll make an incidental reference to a couple that were milestones. Well, one of the first milestones was when I was asked to record a poem for the Cross River Gorilla conference. And that was the first time I'd ever recorded it. Never thought I would do anything like that. I was wearing a different poet's hat then too. And oops, I kicked the table. And so I did it after many takes, and apparently it was shown at the conference, and then made lots of contacts after that, lots of really important contacts. Some pretty eminent people in the conservation area, they liked it, and it was something that they liked having in the conference, in between the talks. So that one I was, I have to say I'm pretty proud of that. But coming back, if I had to choose, one, it would probably be the whale boat, the one that
Which
we
one,
did
sorry?
together. The whale boat.
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah, because it was a great example of a collaboration between the two of us, but it also is heading in a direction that I think, I'd like to go more multimedia, not with me being in front of a camera. That's not my aspiration at all.
Well, today.
Although now with AI, I can probably get a younger version of myself, like Agatha,
Yes.
to read poems, like when I had lots of hair and that sort of thing, and it wasn't grey. So, the whale boat was good because it was very challenging to do. For people who don't know and who can go and have a look at it on the website, it was your experience that I tried to put into words from your notes. And the interesting thing about that is that, it's one of the things I like about being human, is that you can get outside your body and travel in time. You can actually take your imagination somewhere else and put yourself in someone else's shoes and say, how would I feel there in the future? How would I feel about it in the past, which we've done as well, with the time wandering wombat poems, and you can still get it, in the mark. You can hit the mark with it. So I think that was really a milestone.
Yeah.
For collaboration, but it wasn't still. It was a different kind of writing for me, because I normally just do it from my own experience, from my own things there, and I've never been whale watching, so they.
I mean, the poem you wrote, so to explain to people, because I did a trip to Norway to do whale and actually orca watching as well. And when I came back, I had a kind of logbook more in my head, and I explained to you what I would like, and I asked you if you could write a poem as a kind of artistic logbook, travel logbook, following my trip. But obviously, you were not on the trip with me. And you wrote a poem based, on me sharing my experience with you, and the poem is so on point. I couldn't have written it better myself. So you can definitely put yourself in the shoes of someone else. But I love the two examples that you have picked with the gorilla. I've heard lots of balloons.
Well, someone must have liked what we said.
Yeah, it's when I move.
Oh, you got the
there were lots of balloons. I don't know if you could see them, but these two examples that you picked, it's like when you pushed yourself more, you were more in an uncomfortable situation. And I really like that, because that shows that you want to grow also in what you do. I just want to give another example to people watching, because was it last year? We did a collaboration, a kind of collaboration. It was not exactly a collaboration, but with a renowned world artist called S. Devlin. She actually worked with, the biggest rock stars in the world, and she creates their stages for their music concerts. And it happened, I went to a conference with her, and this is when I discovered she was creating an incredible project in London, when she had worked on all the species at risk of extinction in the city of London. which I thought was interesting in itself because she was limiting herself to one city, and I'd love if she can export the project to other cities in the future. But when I came across it, obviously, for us, that was a perfect project for you to write a poem because that's what you do. You write about endangered species. And the fact is you had never been to London, right? So I do remember how challenging it had been for you. And I remember, because I live in London, so I remember I had to brief you about, what does matter for people in London, or, I tried to give you some cues or clues, no. And I remember you took that away. And again, you wrote a wonderful poem and they actually thanked you for that.
Yes, that was particularly challenging, but it's a good exercise.
Yeah.
It's a good exercise.
Yeah.
And it's good to stretch yourself every now and then. You've got a comfort zone where you can be hyper creative in your comfort zone, but sometimes you've got to push outside, and that's, I think we might touch on that a little bit later on as well, or another project that I did. But I just also wanted to mention The Greatest Show on Earth. That was a nice collaboration too, your artwork and my words, because you were doing your thing with the pencil art, and I was just writing my words to go with those images, which is how I actually started out. I actually started out writing about photographs and images that I saw of animals, or what the story I got just from looking at something.
Yeah.
And I still do that a lot. I still get those visual cues about I want to write about that particular image because it says something to me. There's a poem hidden in it somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I enjoyed that one too.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes a mix of creative arts is really interesting. That can create, a new form of art. So moving forward to the future, what are your next steps with poetry, and what can we expect to see from you over the next year?
Well, pretty much a continuation of the same, but there's a few
Anything
different,
in particular? Yeah,
a few different areas that are, as they come up, like deep sea mining was one that came up relatively recently, and I've written a few poems about that. There's nothing on the website yet, but it's something that needs to be opposed, so I'll be happy to add my voice to that. We've got, I think maybe if I was able to just do my own thing, something I'd like to collaborate on even more, I'd like to take that concept you use in the whaleboat, but take it out to a music video. But with my words about things that I get from the music and the images of wildlife, wildlife footage. I've had an idea about that for quite a while, because I like to, I'd like to collaborate with artists like yourself, of course, but photographers as well. I mean, there's some great photographers like Florian Ledoux, Graham Greene, Amy Vitale, but there's also some filmmakers that have some wildlife footage. And this idea came back from two things. It came back from a music video I saw from an 80s band who the lead singer unfortunately has died. But it was called It's My Life, the original version of It's My Life. And the original video for that, when I went to have a look at it, because I heard the original version, I've been used to a different version by I've forgotten the name again. No Doubt. The original version by No Doubt, sorry, the cover version by No Doubt was the one that was mostly on air in the most recent years.
Yeah.
But the original version by Talk Talk, when I went and had a look at it, it was footage that was used in the original Life on Earth series. So it was footage of animals, but also animals in zoos and things like that. And when you look at the word, it's my life, don't you forget. Caught in a trap, it never ends. And so, I would love to have a collaboration with the remaining person from that. And I've befriended him on Instagram, trying to sort of get to a point where I can ask him how that came about, using that video for that song. Because, it's a powerful medium. Music and video is a powerful medium. And on top of that, I also had one collaboration with an unknown artist who's a fabulous artist, one of my favourites in Australia, better than the ones that are famous as far as I'm concerned. And so, I got to know him on Facebook, not LinkedIn, because he's not there. And we had a few exchanges, and I loved a bit of music they'd done. And I suggested he do a video, and that I could maybe do a poem for it. And so we had a bit of a collaboration.
Okay.
He took it we took it in a science fiction direction, where he had the music playing, and he did the vision for it about the extinction of life on Earth. It's called Jurassica, the Jurassica project, and it was about the extinction of the dinosaurs, and we kind of made it more science fiction. But in the end, we got a video out of it, but he didn't like my prose, small, sort of poetic but more prose writing, and he modified it a bit. And I didn't like some of the vision, and I didn't like some of the vision so much. And so it was a project that we just shared the DVD.
Okay, that was a trial. Yeah.
And it was good, but it gave me the idea that there's something there. There's something there about voice, music, and wildlife imagery that I'd like to pursue in the future. So
that's really interesting. I'm smiling inside, because you will discover this in probably in a month. But I'm having a guest on the podcast in about a month, and he's a scientist for space, really, the universe, etc. And I went to a presentation with him in London this week. He's actually living in Norway, but he has combined, because space has inspired music rock stars, many music rock stars. Yes, and he has created a wonderful presentation combining images from space and the music from these rock stars, and it works so well. It was incredible. So you will discover that soon, but that's a really good idea.
I'm certainly familiar with that, because in the late 1970s, there was a video released called The Space Movie, and it used the music of Mike Oldfield from Tubular Bells, who's my favourite artist of all time. But it used music from his third or fourth album called Incantations, and it said that the music was the music from Incantations behind rockets blasting off and satellites and all this sort of stuff. So it's not a new genre by any means, but it's I think it can be really good. And one of the things I actually wanted to do, because I wanted to be involved in that film festival you're talking about in Australia, but I couldn't because of work and all that sort of stuff. I had this vision that I'd like to get something like that done to show during that period, because it would have been a wildlife video, but with more.
Yeah, very good. So last two questions, I think. I wanted to ask you also, for the interest of people watching, are there people in the space where you operate more around wildlife conservation, people who work to raise awareness of wildlife, and people who work to protect endangered wildlife in particular? Are there any particular people that you admire in that space? Are there a few names you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious ones like David Attenborough and Jane Goodall, they're pretty obvious and pretty universal.
Yeah.
But also those photographers I mentioned, I follow their work a lot. I like the work of all wildlife photographers, those that are well known and not well known. As you know, the Cross River Gorilla poem that I did was part of the series of poems I wrote on the New Big Five, which was a project by Graham Greene to try and get people to hunt African animals, but with a camera. So take, which were the 5 top animals you'd like to photograph, not kill. And trophy hunting is another area that I've written lots about, and I'm going to write more about, because there's all sorts of problems, but they're still doing it. At the moment, trophy hunters are still killing super tuskers in Africa, and there's only a handful of super tuskers left, but 2 countries say it's okay to do it because they can make money out of it. And once they're gone, they're gone, So certain things have to be opposed, and you've got to get out there and you've got to speak your mind on them. But in terms of those people, anyone who's out there that who loves wildlife and is doing something to improve the lot of wildlife, well, I'm right behind them. I'd love to collaborate with them.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I'm sure I will see more of it from you in the future. There is no doubt about that. So I actually have 2 more questions for you. So one, which is a surprise, but it will go back to the beginning of our conversation. But you know that I'm launching this new Shades of Life podcast and a digital magazine called Scarlet Red Magazine. So I want to finish each podcast by asking the guests if they have a favorite color or the color that stands out in their life and why, which could be an interesting story about you.
Yes. Well, as you know, I am colorblind, and I did write a poem about color at one point.
That's how that was our first collaboration, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, of course, about that. But, I had forgotten about the very early collaborations about colors.
Because just to tell people, when Anthony and I met and, starting exchanging, I was creating my own creative agency, and I had developed a color palette with 3 colors. And because I liked your writing and your poetry, I asked you if you could write poems about the 3 colors, and you said yes. And I didn't know you were colorblind, which was really funny.
No, but I went back and had a look at our first exchanges in the messaging on LinkedIn, and I told you pretty quickly, I think.
Oh, really? Okay.
After we'd agreed, I think, to do these poems, and it was fun doing those. And it was the first example of writing for somebody else, and it was it was very nice, and a commission from you, which was really good to show what the future could hold. But I'm mostly referring to another poem I wrote about when my wife and I were driving home one day. We saw this double rainbow across the straight highway. Went right across, almost looked like it went from horizon to horizon. And we got out to have a look at it. And my wife, she said, what colors can you see? And I said, I can see the first 3 colors in the big rainbow, not the little, not the secondary rainbow. And she started crying because she saw something entirely different. She saw all these different shades in both rainbows, which I saw variations of shade but no color. I couldn't tell what color they are. And I know in the rainbows that I can see the first 3 colors, and then I can see there's other things there, but I can't identify them because there's not enough of it. Okay. So I have red-green color blindness, and I have brown-green color blindness, which doesn't mean that I can't see those colors, because I can. My problem is if there's not enough of it, or it's in a distance, I can't tell what color a car is until it gets close enough to have a big vision of whether it's green or brown or not only brown cars probably, red or green, or I need to see it. And it was picked up when I was in primary school. I actually found the note from the school health nurse saying I was colorblind and I couldn't do certain things in life, like become an electrician. or a bomb disposal expert, because I wouldn't be able to tell which wires to cut. But it doesn't affect me. The only way it affects me is if there's red flowers on a green tree in the distance. I can't see the red flowers.
Wow.
But I can see the green tree. And even people can show me big colour things, and I can tell them basically the colours. It's only those little colourblind tests with all the tiny dots.
Yeah.
People hold them up and say, "What's in here?" And I say, "Oh yeah, the number 10, the letter L, nothing." What? Nothing? It's colourblind because everyone else can see it and I can't. And I remember actually there was BMW ad that said, if you can't see the car in this thing here, you couldn't be a BMW person working on spray painting or whatever. And I couldn't see it. Nothing in there whatsoever.
Wow.
So I am colourblind, technically colourblind. Having said that, my favourite colours is the red spectrum, but not the bright red spectrum, the darker red. And so when I looked that up to see what that actually was, I came up with crimson as my favourite colour.
And I like it very much. And when I actually asked you to prepare this question, you didn't know the name of my magazine yet. You didn't know my color was red. So, we are colliding again.
Yes, we're kind of on the different ends of the red spectrum, but it's still the red spectrum, which is interesting. I like other colors, but I gravitate towards the deeper reds, which apparently crimson is a mixture of, it's a tinge of purple in the red.
Yeah.
And scarlet, apparently, it's more towards the orange.
Makes it a bit more bone. Yeah.
Yeah. But mostly, I've done my research here. I actually looked up what that actually meant. And so for me, with the crimson and the purple tinge, it's we talked about the history of who's used the color before and some of the symbology behind it. But what they said was passion, love, strength, and rebirth. But I also looked up yours for scarlet.
Oh my God! Yes.
And it said courage, passion, heat, and joy. So I'll run with mine. I'm pretty happy with those things.
Yeah, very good. I'm impressed by the research. Very good. So last question before we finish, Anthony. You did say that when, you kind of found your purpose with poetry, wildlife poetry, it brought you back to your earlier years when you were a 10-year-old boy. And there is this beautiful picture of you as a 10-year-old boy where you have the turtle and the lizards on you. If you had your 10-year-old self in front of you today, what would you say to him today? Would you have any advice for your 10 years old?
Well, I think the first thing that I wanted to be, when I started going to school, and then you realize you had to choose a profession, the first thing I wanted to be was a zoologist. And then I remember towards the end of school, I went and had a talk to the forestry department. My father took me along and we had a discussion about what jobs might be available in the Queensland Forestry Department. But not long after school, I chose a different path altogether and, got married young and had children and all that sort of thing. And then all that time from around, 20 or so, up to 61, 62 was all, a big circle away from what I wanted to do. Really, I did everything in there except what I really wanted to do. All with the view of sort of trying to, make some money to retire and do whatever I wanted, but not to be. But anyway, I'm happy now. As you rightly pointed out, happiness is not the be all and end all of everything, because you can't be happy about everything in your life, but to be happy within yourself and what what brings you the most happiness. What brings me the most happiness is sitting down and writing. Based on my experience in life now, because I wouldn't have been able to do it when I was young, it would have been pretty shallow. One of the benefits of being my age now is that, I do research my poems about the animals, but I write them first. I write it first from what I know. And just from life experience and watching David Attenborough and Wild Kingdom when I was younger, as a child, and everything in between, and everything I've read in between, there's a lot of stuff available, and I will invariably write the bulk of the poem first, and then I'll go in and fill in some more scientific details so that people actually get a bit more of a bit more value in the poem for the animal, and a bit more verified information, because some of it can be opinions. Look, of course, I'd like to have kept on the path from when I was younger. I don't know where I'd be now. But that's one of those things. And I wouldn't have had the experience would have been different. I wouldn't have had the experience I have now to launch into it, because it's still very early days. Like 3 years into it is still pretty early.
Yeah, and you did reconnect with your childhood and much later. And as you say, we do accumulate experiences, wisdom. We have tools we didn't have in the past, obviously, and that's all part of the picture. Well, thank you, Anthony, and thank you for everything you do for the animal cause through the art of poetry. I really encourage people to discover your work on the 1millionpoetry.com. There are a ton of wonderful poems there, and that's a good starting point to discover your work. Thank you to everybody for watching and listening, and I will see you for a next episode of Shades of Life.
Thank you very much also, Ingrid, for not only this podcast and this new path and potential collaboration, but all that we've done up in the 3 years till now.
Yeah. It's been a good ride, and we're going to continue on it. Thank you.